Hello, everybody. This is a lecture kind of going over the scoring for the free response, so the essays. I'm going to be focusing on the prose response to last year's exam, the one for 2014. Um, in this portion, the excerpt was from the novel The Known World by Edward P. Jones. The passage in the PDF available on College Board website, they couldn't get the copyright permission, but it is available on Google Books. So we will quickly read this and then look at some of the responses. Okay. So I'll be reading. If you want to, fast forward through the lecture to get to the essays, feel free to do that. The evening his master died, he worked again well after he ended the day for the other adults, his own wife among them, and sent them back with hunger and tiredness to their cabins. The young ones, his son among them, had been sent out of the fields an hour or so before the adults to prepare the late supper and, if there was time enough, to play in the few minutes of sun that were left. When he, Moses, finally freed himself of the ancient and brittle harness that connected him to the oldest mule his master owned, all that was left of the sun was a 5-inch long memory of red-orange laid out in still waves across the horizon between two mountains on the left and one on the right. He had been in the fields for all of 15 hours. He paused before leaving the fields as the evening quiet wrapped itself around him. The mule quivered, wanting home and rest. Moses closed his eyes and bent down and took a pinch of the soil and ate it with no more thought than if it were a spot of cornbread. He worked the dirt around in his mouth and swallowed, leaning his head back and opening his eyes in time to see the strip of sun fade to dark blue and then to nothing. He was the only man in the realm, slave or free, who ate dirt, but while the bondage women, particularly the pregnant ones, ate it for some incomprehensible need, for that something that ash cakes and apples and fatback did not give their bodies, he ate it not only to discover the strengths and weaknesses of the field, but because the eating of it tied him to the only thing in his small world that meant almost as much as his own life. This was July, and July dirt tasted even more like sweetened metal than the dirt of June or May. Something in the growing crops unleashed a metallic life that only began to dissipate in mid-August, and by harvest time that life would be gone altogether, replaced by a sour moldiness he associated with the coming of fall and winter, the end of a relationship he had begun with the first taste of dirt back in March, before the first hard spring rain. Now, with the sun gone and no moon and the darkness having taken a nice hold of him, he walked to the end of the row, holding the mule by the tail. In the clearing he dropped the tail and moved around the mule toward the barn. The mule followed him, and after he had prepared the animal for the night and came out, Moses smelled the coming of the rain. He breathed deeply, feeling it surge through him. Believing he was alone, he smiled. He knelt down to be closer to the earth and breathed deeply some more. Finally, when the effect began to dwindle, he stood and turned away, for the third time that week, from the path that led to the narrow lane of the quarters with its people and his own cabin, his woman, and his boy. His wife knew enough now not to wait for him to come and eat with them. On a night, with the moon, he could see some of the smoke rising from the world that was the lane, home and food and rest and what passed in many cabins for the life of family. He turned his head slightly to the right and made out what he thought was the sound of playing children, but when he turned his head back, he could hear far more clearly the last bird of the day as it evening chirped in the small forest off to the left. He went straight ahead to the furthest edge of the cornfields to a patch of woods that had yielded nothing of value since the day his master bought it from a white man who had gone broke and returned to Ireland. I did well over there, the man lied to his people back in Ireland, his dying wife standing hunched over beside him. But I longed for all of you and for the wealth of my homeland. The patch of woods of no more than 3 acres did yield some soft blue grass that no animal would touch, and many trees that no one could identify. Just before Moses stepped into the woods, the rain began, and as he walked on, the rain became heavier. Well into the forest, the rain came in torrents through the trees and their mighty summer leaves, and after a bit Moses stopped and held out his hands and collected water that he washed over his face. Then he undressed down to his nakedness and lay down. To keep the rain out of his nose, he rolled up his shirt and placed it under his head so that it tilted just enough for the rain to flow down about his face. When he was an old man and rheumatism chained up his body, he would look back and blame the chains on evenings such as these, and on nights when he lost himself completely and fell asleep and didn't come to until morning, covered with dew. The ground was almost soaked. The leaves seemed to soften the hard rain as it fell and hit his body and his face with no more power than the gentle tapping of fingers. He opened his mouth. It was rare for him in the rain to meet up like this. Okay, so that is, from what I can tell, the extent of the passage that that the College Board included on the actual test. So here are some of the responses. So this is the first response that a student wrote. And then again, be paying attention for all of the things that you would be paying attention for in your own writing. Once again, looking at the prompt, right? In a well-organized essay, analyze how the author reveals the character of Moses. So again, as we've talked about in class, the prose passages really tend to focus on character development. In your analysis, you may wish to consider such literary elements as point of view, selection of detail, and imagery. So let's see how these people responded. Oops, that's not the one I want. The balance of man between nature and society is often a fine line difficultly straddled. The character of Moses from Edward P. Jones's novel, The Known World, elects to reject this balance almost completely and immerse near fully in the wonders of nature. For him, the power of nature overwhelms his bond with his fellow man, overriding any need to socialize and be with others. If there was ever a man who knew where he truly belonged, it is Moses. At the beginning of the excerpt, Moses' dedication is made clear. Even on the evening his master died, he worked again well after he ended the day for the other adults, showing that Moses takes more solace in his work in the field than with the company of others. The end of the day is his time to commune with nature, while for others it is a time to satiate the hunger and tiredness that Moses has sent them home with. Moses' appreciation for nature is displayed through the narrator's, albeit third-person, description of the setting sun as a 5-inch long memory of red-orange laid out in stillness across the horizon. This imagery's beauty can only be rivaled by the true experience Moses has due to its sheer vividness. Almost taking this sunset as a signal, Moses begins his meditation with nature. The first step in Moses' ritual is the consumption of soil. The author's intent here is likely to demonstrate just how attached Moses is to the world around him. He eats the dirt as if it were a spot of cornbread, displaying a high level of familiarity and comfort. I'm not sure what this says. If what must would call an odd activity, in what we must call an odd activity. His reason in the act is that doing so enables him to discover the strengths and weaknesses of the field at a base level, paralleling his drive for work. However, more importantly, the process tied him to the only thing in his small world that meant almost as much as his own life, plainly highlighting his devotion to nature. His wife and children pale in comparison to the majesty of nature. The first portion complete, Moses moves on to the next phase. Moses' journey with nature continues, with the sun gone and no man and the darkness having taken a nice hold of him. Jones's choice of the word nice likely serves to contrast Moses' opinion of darkness with the normal perspective. While many people fear darkness, Moses welcomes its embrace. The description also personifies the darkness, lending more power to nature. Clearly in tune with nature, Moses next smells the coming of the rain. He lets the air surge through him, accepting after the soil another fragment of nature within. Then, neglecting the sound of playing children, Moses chooses to hear the last bird of the day as it evening chirped. His rejection of the children and refusal to return to his wife and eat dinner, instead venturing into the forest, reveals that Moses' true allegiance lies with people, not civilization. With nature, not civilization. As the rain begins, Moses enters the forest alone. He proceeds to collect water that he washes over his face, cleansing himself of society's sin. Then he undresses down to his nakedness and lies down, eschewing the last vestiges of artificiality and returning to the pure form with which he entered the world. He loses himself completely and doesn't care, or doesn't move. And doesn't come to until morning, covered with dew. Having given himself to nature and been reborn like a child emerging from the womb covered in fluid, the profound imagery encapsulates Moses' connection with nature. It is his mother, his father, his everything. It completes him more than his real family. When Moses is in nature, then and only then is he at peace. So I'm going to, instead of reading through all the essays together, I'm going to read through the comments. So here is what the review board says. This clearly upper-level essay makes a sophisticated and compelling claim that the power of nature overwhelms Moses' bond with his fellow man. Allowing the chronology of the passage to structure the essay, so see, they're looking at thesis, then organization, the student argues that the end of the day is Moses' time to commune with nature, and that this communion brings solace. Using implicit analysis of literary devices, notably imagery, symbolism, and personification, the essay explains why Moses' foray into the woods is a spiritual experience. It successively characterizes Moses' deliberate actions as meditation and ritual, and reads Moses' taking of natural elements into his body as a kind of sacrament. Moses lets the air surge through him, accepting, after the soil, another fragment of nature within. Remaining tightly focused on his argument, the essay speaks of Moses' figurative baptism as he ritually cleanses himself of society's sins, eschews the last vestiges of artificiality, and returns to the pure form with which he entered the world. This essay convincingly argues that once Moses has given himself up to nature and been reborn like a child emerging from the womb, nature is his mother, his father, his everything. It completes him more than his real family. The strength of this essay lies not only in the persuasiveness of its tight argument, but also in the smooth incorporation of well-chosen references to the passage in its analytical sentences. So, well-chosen references, right, the evidence, and then also in its analysis. While the essay uses rich, evocative diction to create nuance and carefully evidence argument, its prose is sometimes less consistently controlled. So, the opening sentence, the balance of man between nature and society is often a line difficultly straddled. So kind of mixing metaphors there. His reason in the act is that doing so enables him to discover. Right? It doesn't really mean anything. That's an empty sentence. So that this essay earned a score of 8 rather than 9. Okay? So yeah, I want to bring us to the rubric that I use in your class. Right? So, again, this would follow very similarly, right? The sacramental kind of imagery that the essay develops, that's a really sophisticated response to the prompt. And within the amount of time that this was written, it's kind of impressive that the author was able to do this, right? And let's see, it has a clear order, right? Kind of thinking through as if we're thinking of ritual and meditation and baptism, we're thinking of these sacramental images, then the author of this essay has kind of gone through, structured the paragraphs according to different stages of the ritual, right? So there is kind of an inherent logical progression in the essay itself. Specific passages that help to support the argument in topic sentences, and then clear explanations as well. And then so really kind of what the review board was looking at was that just some places where the essay wasn't really saying anything, where it was kind of spinning its wheels, or where there was like a mixed metaphor, so that it wasn't just merely that a mistake, but rather the essay could have maybe, the author could have maybe gone back to revise that sentence because the sentence is empty. Okay? So as you can see, the same rubric, right, that I'm using for your papers that you've been trained to be thinking about, this is what the review board is looking at as well. So let's go back to the second essay. Sorry, I don't know why PDF reader was being glitchy. Okay, here we go. Edward Jones introduces Moses as one and the same with nature. He implements great detail and literary devices to show how worldly of a man Moses is and his appreciation for the earth, even when he has not much for himself. So this is their, this is the introduction. I know it doesn't really look like it, but this is an indentation here. So right off the bat, this is less specific, right? The specificity of the thesis is not quite as detailed as what we saw above, although it's not bad. But what we have here as the kind of thesis sentence, right? The power of nature overwhelms his bond with his fellow man, overriding any need to socialize and be with others. This is really kind of the man idea. So a kind of almost spiritual power, right, that overwhelms everything else. And although this student did not go back and incorporate specifically the language of spiritual ritual into this introduction, you can kind of see that with this language of overwhelming bonds. But this one here we see is just less specific, right? One and the same with nature, that's good. But then it goes on that he uses detail and literary devices, which is kind of vague, to show how worldly of a man he is. Okay, so first body paragraph. Jones doesn't introduce Moses for a few sentences, though, first describing the kind of life he lives. The author pays close attention at first to their lives of intense labor, long work days, hunger, and tiredness. Then we begin to see the character of Moses. Jones begins with using imagery to describe the beautiful scenery of sunset and its red-orange laid out in still waves, how it's surrounded by mountains. Here we can tell by Jones's close attention to detail of the sunset that this passage will be closely focused on nature and its impact on the character. This is, again, a kind of empty sentence. Jones then describes Moses eating the soil. It's such an odd act, and it catches your attention. It's not a normal thing to do, eat soil. Jones tells that only the women pregnant eat it for some incomprehensible reason, insinuating that it's unnecessary. However, he says that Moses eats the soil mainly because it tied him to the only thing in the world with meaning to him other than his own life. From here, we can infer that he is talking about the earth, and that it takes precedence over work, family, friends, etc. This is further confirmed later on in the passage when Moses sees his family waiting for him to come to supper, and he turns to walk further into the forest, to not return until the next morning. Jones writes this with a very close relation to Moses. He writes from a third-person point of view, but it's as if he's right there in Moses' mind with him, and it makes it feel as though Moses is telling about his intimate relationship with nature himself. Jones describes in great detail the changing of the soil, and by the seasons and imagery to describe the taste of the sweet metal of July or the sour moldiness of fall and winter. As the passage goes on, Moses' connection with nature is revealed a little more and a little more intensely. Jones describes the powerful scene of Moses being able to smell the rain, feeling it surge through him. He conveys it in a way that it seems as if it is Moses' drug and he is getting some sort of insane high from it. When Moses' attention turns to his wife and kids, Jones lacks detail in then explaining Moses' home life of simply the cabin, home, and food and rest. Nothing compared to the amount of detail he uses when writing about the experiences Moses has with nature. The end of the final paragraph is by far the most intense. Here we get a much deeper understanding of the level of intimacy Moses has with the earth. Jones allows us to understand this through his point of view as the author. He describes to us exactly what Moses is feeling about becoming old and feeling chained because he just lost himself under the rain and trees for so many nights. The descriptive detail, however, and the intense imagery in the last few sentences are what really characterizes Moses. The fact that the rain came in torrents and Moses undressed to his nakedness and laid down, and then didn't come to until morning, covered with dew, shows us that this connection Moses has with the world is indescribable. It is so intense, and he basically sees himself as one with nature. Jones allows us to see the relationship clearly through his use of detailed imagery and his own relationship to Moses in telling the story. So let's see what the reviewers said. The upper half essay this upper half essay makes the reasonable claim, so reasonable as opposed to kind of surprising or insightful, right? The reasonable claim that Jones introduces Moses as one and the same with nature. But it goes about its argument much less adroitly, like expertly or gracefully, than the essay scored as an 8 above. The essay's attempts to analyze imagery, detail, and action in the second paragraph yield some interesting ideas. Its reading of what's incomprehensible, its discussion of third-person point of view. But in general, its insights are less perceptive than those typical of a higher-scoring essay. For example, we can tell by Jones's close attention to the detail of the sunset that the passage will be closely focused on nature. The last third of the essay references the text but offers less perceptive analysis in language that is at once more colloquial. It seemed as though the smell of rain is Moses' drug and he's getting some sort of insane high from it. So it's also less specific. The end of the paragraph is by far the most intense and also less consistently in control of the elements of effective composition. He describes just exactly what Moses is feeling about becoming old and feeling chained because he just lost himself under the rain and trees for so many nights. Okay, that's a hard sentence to say out loud, although it makes sense for reading. So the language becomes colloquial. It becomes less specific, and it is less consistently in control of the elements of effective composition. So there's style errors and mechanical errors. So going back to ours, I agree with this, right? A solid paper, it has an appropriate response. It's clear, but maybe it doesn't have a surprising insight, right? It has lapses of development. Maybe it's not quite developing, acknowledging the complexity of its own central idea, and it's careful, but maybe not kind of analytical or critical reading. As we've said before, organization is stressed less by the College Board, so we don't necessarily need to focus on this so much, but it's maybe more kind of driven by, well, I guess it's kind of in between, right? Whereas we were thinking about the order of the ritual in that first essay, she's not going through and having like a paragraph on personification, a paragraph on imagery, and then a paragraph on diction, but rather somewhere kind of in between, kind of thinking about, instead of structuring her paper according to the ritual, she's kind of just talking about the first part of the passage, the second part of the passage, the third part of the passage. So it's not developing from her argument, but developing from the text itself. The evidence, right? I think she does a pretty good job of using specific passages of evidence, but I agree with them here, right? That the discussion about how it's more intense, it's not really developed like the kind of so what, and it's not very clear about like what makes it so much more intense. She's struggling to kind of explain where the intensity comes from, like from diction or from imagery, and then I think pretty good in terms of style and mechanics, but as they pointed out in the passage you just read, there's some minor places, right? Some minor places there's issues. So you can kind of see that this is, again, very much lines up with what you've been used to seeing in our AP classes. Now, I'm not going to really focus too much on the third essay, which is in the bottom tier, mostly because I don't really think that you guys are in much risk for running into that. I think that most of you will be kind of straddling somewhere in this range between a 9 and a 6. So I'm not too worried about that. If we go back to looking at some of the scoring, right? That once we get into the bottom tier, it's people who go off topic, right? So if you are not really talking about textual analysis, but you're talking about some topic that's like you're starting off with the paper and then you just start talking about, I don't know, your own thoughts about religion or your own thoughts about history or your own thoughts about gender, and it's like not really analyzing the text, right? You just have gotten off topic. Or if you've misread something, which I'm not worried about you guys doing that. So if they're have misread the passage or it's too brief, that would only, I think, be if you've run out of time. Or again, if you're doing textual analysis but you're not really talking about character, which is the main topic of the prompt, okay, so I'm not really worried about you guys being in that range, right? I think that for the most of you, you guys are going to be in this range here, which, as we've talked about, is very closely related to the rubric we use in the class in the A and the B range. So I think, again, the main thing to focus on is working towards getting the timing right. Okay, so you have a pretty good sense of how the scoring works for the free response, right? And then, oh, I guess I didn't say this, but that kind of summary and paraphrase instead of analysis. I'm not really worried about you guys falling into this trap. But anyway, so what you need to be working on is practicing on the timing, making sure that you're able to write the 3 free response essays within 2 hours, spending about 40 minutes on each essay, and that gives you a little bit of spare time as wiggle room and to do some review. So I hope that this has been helpful. This is very similar to what we talked about in class, and you can get a sense, right, of the reviewers are looking for things that you know what they're looking for. So you can do this.